Right. So warm greetings to you, and I would like to welcome you to our first lecture class for AUE 3761 in this 2024 academic year. And what we'll be looking at is lecture one, where I'll be dealing with part one, rather, pertaining to the introduction to the audit process. Right. Now, what you discover in this particular topic, most of the aspects that are covered within this particular topic, or rather learning unit, it's really pertaining a lot to do with the recap of concepts that you were introduced to in the second year level, particularly in AUE 2601. Right. So it's more of a recap. So what I did is I decided to divide this content into three parts. So you'd notice that for today's session, we are going to give special focus to part one, which deals with the auditing concepts. And that really mainly deals with an introduction to the concept of auditing, right? And then part two deals with regulation of the auditor. Because obviously, like any other profession, there are certain laws and regulations that governs the way you conduct yourself in the profession and the way you engage with certain parties to which you'll be performing or offering a service to. So the same is true with audit. There are certain regulatory frameworks or certain laws and regulations that actually governs the way auditors perform their audit functionalities or activities with the third parties, right? Part three deals with the King 4 report on corporate governance in South Africa. Now you discover that all of these three parts that I'm going to unveil as we progress, but of course with special focus to part one, all of them, how they actually test them in AUE 3761, they actually test the application of the concepts. That's what they test. So it's not only an issue of testing theory or semantic background of these concepts, as in the sense of saying, for instance, they ask you to define a particular principle, or they ask you to, to explain a particular concept per se, but the manner by which they examine or test you guys with regards to majority of these concepts, and the same is true even actually when you go to various other topics within the module, they always test you the application of the concepts to the question that they would actually bring to you in the exam, be it even in the year tests as well. So you need to be in that position whereby after each and every one of these lecture sessions that we will do, you must be in a place where you are able to answer a practical question and being able to apply those principles that I would have actually taught you guys. So without any further ado, so this was just to give you guys an essential topic outline within the first topic of AUE 3761, which is auditing concepts and introduction to auditing. Now, so that's what we'll be focusing on as part of, as our part one to this lecture. Now, what are the assumed knowledge? In other words, the essential learning objectives, the essential learning objectives that you are expected to master by the end of this lesson. So number one, you should be in a place where you have an understanding of the various stages in the audit process. You should be able to have a comprehensive understanding of who an auditor is, the various types of auditors that exist out there. But of course, within this within the arena of AUE 3761, we are mainly interested or focused on the registered auditor, or what they call an external auditor, whose primary focus would always be the audit of annual financial statements of an organization. There are other various types of auditors out there, such as the internal auditors, government auditors, you name them, right? So we're gonna have a look at the differences between those various types of auditors out there, right? And then, of course, you should also be in a place where you have an understanding of the concept on assurance as well as non-assurance engagements. Because the two, they are not the same, they are actually different. So you must be able to disseminate the difference between the two and to also understand the categories that fall within each one of them, right? Because under assurance, for example, assurance engagements, you find that there are two types. There's what we call reasonable assurance, and then there's what we call limited, all right, assurance engagements. So you must be able to disseminate between the two within that umbrella of assurance engagements. And the same thing is true with non-assurance engagements. We're going to also have a look at that. Now, furthermore, with the learning objectives, you should be able to know the 8 auditing postulates. The 8 auditing postulates. So these are like foundational stone or principles that auditing as a fraternity or a specialty is built up on. So there are 8 auditing postulates that you need to remember, right? And then, of course, you should also be in a place where you have an understanding of the objectives of the independent auditor for assurance engagement. So we are saying now in a spectrum where you are conducting an assurance engagement, regardless of whether it's a reasonable assurance or it's a limited assurance, what is the primary objective that you have when you're conducting an assurance engagement, right? So we're going to have a look at that. So very important to recall, all of these principles or rather concepts, you were introduced to these at a second year level. So what I'm just simply doing right now, I'm doing a recap for you on the principles that you were introduced to in AUE 2601. So I'm just going to quickly go back through them again. Understanding the stages in the audit process, understanding the auditor, assurance and non-assurance engagements, being able to, to explain the 8 auditing postulates, the accounting profession, and of course, understanding the objectives of an independent auditor for assurance engagements, right? So without any further ado, so the assumed knowledge are just so that you guys understand what I refer to under normal circumstances. When I'm saying assumed knowledge, you discover for every learning unit that we're going to be discussing, there will be assumed knowledge for each one of them. What I refer to as assumed knowledge, these are what I call essential learning objectives, right? That are important for you to master, for you to be able to be capacitated to answer questions that will come in your year tests, because you're going to have year tests throughout this academic year 2024, right? And then, of course, you also then have your examination at the end of the semester, or rather at the end of the year, since this is a year module. So that is how this AUE 3761 module is structured. So when I'm referring to assumed knowledge, these are simply your key learning objectives, things that you need to know for each one of those topics, which will be highly examined, whether in the year test or in the case of an examination, right? So without further ado, we're going to progress further, right? Part 1. Continued. So the first assumed knowledge element that I indicated is pertaining to understanding the stages in the audit process. I'm going to take some bit of time here so that I can explain some important things from this particular element. Now, the audit stages, or rather should I say the audit process itself, it is made up of 4 important steps. 4 important steps. So the first one being preliminary audit engagement activities. Now, the preliminary audit engagement activities, these are the ones that you carry out, and they are determinant factors of whether or not you would accept or reject an audit client. So there are certain things, or should I say activities, that have to be carried out by the auditor to determine whether they would accept the audit client or reject the audit client. In the concept of a year test or in the concept of an exam, they would ask you to discuss the preliminary audit engagement activities that should have been performed by a particular organization before accepting the audit client in question. So they'll give you some sort of like a case study scenario. And in that case study scenario, they would explain to you certain events that have transpired, which led to the auditors accepting the audit client in question. So now you need to evaluate the actions or the events that took place, right? So that you can determine whether the auditors actually followed the principles that are supposed to be conducted during the preliminary audit engagement activities according to the ISA standards, right? So that's what stage 1 of the audit process deals with. Now, you were introduced to this, obviously, in AUE 2601. So we're going to unveil this in detail, not only in learning unit or lesson 1 in your study materials, but you also find it in lesson number 2, which is really learning unit number 2 of your study guide. So we're going to have a look at that particular stage of the audit process in a greater detail. And I will also show you how you can actually, apply those principles in a real-life case study scenario, right? Then stage number 2 in the audit process is what we call the planning and audit stage. Now, the planning and audit stage in the audit process, obviously, there are certain activities that the auditor would actually perform in order for them to plan for the audit that they've been hired for by the shareholders of the organization, right? So you need to know if activities that we as auditors would actually perform in the planning stage of an audit, right? And that is what we will be dealing with when we go to learning unit number 3 in your study guide. Then stage number 3 deals with obtaining audit evidence, right? The audit's further responses to risk. Because obviously during the planning and audit, it's not only an issue of planning activities that you would perform when you now go about carrying out the actual audit itself, but you also do perform what we call a risk assessment. And in a process of performing or conducting a risk assessment, that is where you are able to determine or identify the risks which the organization is exposed to, which could potentially lead to material misstatements in its annual financial statements. And not only that, but also which could lead to maybe possible errors or fraudulent reporting in their financial information, right? So when we go to stage number 3 now, we are now able to then gather evidence which would help us to be able to identify, obviously, those risk areas, how the organization can be able to address certain risk exposures that they could be, vulnerable to, right? So that's what stage number 3 deals with, but obviously that's also another stage where you discover that the auditor would begin to perform what we call audit engagement procedures, because the only way that you can be able to gather evidence, it is when you begin to perform the actual audit engagement procedures, right? So what are audit procedures? Audit procedures, these are specific instructions, actions, definite actions, which the auditor carries out in order for him or her to collect sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, right? Very important. So that's what you normally or primarily see when we get to stage number 3 of obtaining audit evidence. We collect audit evidence by conducting or performing audit procedures. Learning unit 4 to learning unit number 10 in your study guide, it deals vividly with regards to this particular concept. And what you discover in your exam or even in your year tests, right? They would ask you to perform audit procedures, maybe concerning to a specific account. It could be the inventory account balance, and they want you to perform audit procedures concerning the inventory account balance reflected in the statement of financial position, for example. They could ask you to perform audit engagement procedures concerning the revenue balance as reflected in the statement of profit or loss and other comprehensive income. So when they ask you to perform those procedures, you must be in a position where you know where to begin. In other words, also, you should be in a position where you know how to go about performing or drafting those audit procedures, right? So in stage number 3 of the audit process, we will be dealing or unveiling the process that is carried out when you want to formulate audit procedures. I'm going to deal with that in a greater detail when we get to that level. But for now, I don't want to get into details. Then stage number 4, which is normally the last stage in your audit process, is where we perform evaluations of the evidence that we would have gathered in stage number 3. We also then, from the evaluations that we would have done, that's where we will be able to draw conclusions, all right, and then generate a report that will be presented to the interested parties, right? And that report is what we can, in the case of an audit engagement, that's what we will call an audit report. In the case of a limited assurance, it will be a conclusion, all right? You draw a conclusion in that report. In a case of an audit engagement, or rather an audit report, you would express what we call an audit opinion, okay? Right. So, but you're going to learn more about those things when we get into that stage. But that is primarily learning unit number 11, according to your study guide. It's very, very important stages in the audit process that you need to take note of. And all of this, you discover most of your questions in the year tests, most of the questions that you get even in the exam, they are really primarily centralized on events, activities that are taking place within the audit process. So very important to take note of this. Now, obviously, you cannot just look at them in isolation. There are certain acts, regulatory acts. So when you're talking of acts, we are referring to laws, regulations, right? And codes to keep in mind throughout the audit process. So whenever we as auditors are assigned to perform or conduct an audit engagement, we have to ensure that our activities, or rather the responsibilities that we will carry out, we are carrying them in line with the Companies Act, in line with the Audit Profession Act, which you normally gets abbreviated as APA. If you go through your study guide, normally you would come across such abbreviations. So APA simply stands for the Audit Profession Act. And then, of course, the King 4 report, which we are going to deal with as part 3 to this particular lecture number 1 that we are looking at. Now, of course, also you need to bear in mind that we as auditors, we are supposed to do, we're supposed to perform our responsibilities with observance of ethical codes of conduct, which is according to the SICA Code of Professional Conduct, CPC, and the IRBA, CPC, as well as the IRBA rules regarding improper conducts, right? So these are all what I would call writings or emblems that governs how we as auditors are supposed to perform our duties in the process of conducting an audit engagement. So we have to always observe, number 1, the law, and at the same time observe the codes of conducts of the audit profession that are publicized through different professional bodies there, right? So that's what the stages of the audit process are, and that's what they entail at a high level. Of course, we have to go into each one of them individually in details, but we will be doing that obviously as we progress further. But I just wanted to give you a broader picture so that you understand why understanding of the stages in the audit process is very important in AUE 3761. And how it resonates with how the lecturers examines you guys in the year tests, how they examine you guys, of course, in the case of an actual examination itself, right? Then we move forward. Now, let's talk about the auditor, right? Let's talk about the auditor. So there are certain objectives that I've outlined that you need to know regarding to an auditor, right? But regardless of whether it's a registered auditor or an external auditor, as it were, or if it's an internal auditor, a government auditor, fraud investigators, whatever the case, there are certain things that auditors are expected to do. There are certain characteristics that is common, or should I say that is, expected of auditors, regardless of the category or classification of auditors. And also we're going to be looking at the need for auditors in general. Why do organizations need to interact with auditors? Not only organization in the sense of companies, but also even think about non-profit organizations, which of course would also involve the public. Why would the public need auditors to be there, right? What is that value that is important that can be achieved by having auditors in existence? We're going to be explaining that when we get to this learning objective. Then, of course, we'll be looking at other specific theories as they relate to businesses, auditing, and the profession. So we're going to be looking at all of that as we progress in this engagement. Now, let's explain, right? What are those roles, activities, functionalities in general that auditors would perform? Auditors are there to provide assurance, right, pertaining to information prepared or presented by one party to another party with the intention of inspiring confidence in the fairness of the information which is being prepared or presented to the intended user. Okay, right. Now, I want you to understand something from that explanation of these outlines. Number one, auditors express, or they give what we call assurance. They provide assurance. This assurance is given concerning what? Concerning information that has been prepared or presented by one party to another party. So there's the one party is preparing the information, and the other party is receiving the information, or rather using the information that has been prepared. Now, the party that is receiving the information that has been prepared, which I would classify as the user, all right, they may not always have absolute faith in the ones that are presenting the information to them. In other words, the responsible party. So that's where auditors comes in. Now, the auditors will then be able to evaluate the information given by the presenting party, all right? They will evaluate that information and then give an assurance as to whether the information provided can be relied upon by the user, all right? So that is what is, the primary role that auditors, regardless of their categories, that's one primary thing that is common amongst auditors. They'll be given information, they have to evaluate the information, assess whether that information can be relied upon by the user or not. Think of it in the sense like, for instance, internal auditors, for example, they perform different types of audit engagements, right? It could be compliance audit engagement, for example. So what is happening is when the internal auditors come to an organization, they will be looking at what the organization is doing versus what their policy stipulates. If they identify that there is a deviation between the policy and what the organization is doing, guess what? They would have to report that to the interested parties, because the interested parties would want to know whether or not what the organization is doing is in accordance to the policy. That's where assurance comes in. So I'm just explaining in the umbrella of internal auditors, right? Just so that you understand when we're saying that auditors in general, they provide assurance pertaining to information prepared. By who? By one party to another party with the intention of inspiring confidence in the fairness of the information which is being prepared or presented to the intended user. An audit ensures credibility of the presented information thereof. So the whole core behind an audit is so that we can be able to know whether there is credibility in the information that is being presented to us if we are the users, all right? Think about it in the concept of shareholders. Shareholders, they would want to know, before they invest their money into an organization, they want to know whether what is being reported in the annual financial statements is actually true, or whether it truly reflects how the company is performing. But the question is, how do they achieve that particular objective before they invest their money in the organization? That's where registered or external auditors comes in, right? It's very important. So this is just to explain the overall or primary objective of an audit, or rather an auditor in general, right? Then now let's proceed. There are different types of auditors. There are different types of auditors, and I also explained, but not in detail, when we started the session. So among us, others, you'll find that there is what we call the registered or external auditors. I'll explain what registered or external auditors are, what they do, and all. And then there's what we call internal auditors. There's also another group that is called forensic auditors. Now, and then the special purpose auditors. So these are the different types of auditors that exist out there, and they are not the same in the sense of their primary responsibilities to their, to their clients. For instance, when you're looking at external auditors, so you discover there's some footnotes. I'm just trying to see how I can be able to view that, right? But there's some footnotes that I've put. I'm not sure how I can be able to, okay. I'm not sure if you can see it on your side, but on my side, I think on the presentation, I may not be able to be reading the notes for you, the footnotes, because you discover that, for instance, for each one of these auditors, I've given an explanation of who these auditors are and what they do. So let's start with the first one, which is the registered auditors, or what they call external auditors. So with the registered auditors or external auditors, these are the type of auditors who express an independent opinion on whether the annual financial statements of a company fairly present the financial position and results of the company's operations. Right? So in other words, what external auditors are there for? They are there to express an independent audit opinion with regards to the credibility of annual financial statements. So their primary focus is to do with the financial statements of an organization. Then there's a second group called the internal auditors. Now with internal auditors, this one, they are those type of auditors who perform independent assignments on behalf of the board of directors of the company. Notice, what do? They perform independent assignments. So there are specific assignments that the board could request of the internal auditors to perform on their behalf. What are those type of assignments that can be requested of the internal auditors? This could be, for instance, the compliance audit that I mentioned earlier. They could also be involved in financial audits, but with the financial audits here, their primary focus is not expressing an independent audit opinion concerning the fairness of presentation of annual financial statements. No, but it could be just with regards to the financial systems that have been used, to generate those financial statements. That's what the internal auditors could be interested in. Right? They could also perform IT auditing, for example, right? So those are what we call independent assignments that could come as per request of the board. Then we've got what we call government auditors. With the government auditors, these ones, they perform a role that is similar to that of the internal auditor. The only difference is that they perform those roles within the government departments. All right. So, for instance, what they do is they perform evaluations and as well as investigating the financial affairs of various government departments, report their findings to senior government. Like, for instance, what is happening currently in South Africa, there's this issue of the state capture, right, where the government have been able to discover that there's been certain funds that have not been used according to their intended purpose. In other words, there was fraudulent and corruption activities that transpired. Now, how did the government get to that place where they were able to uncover such events? It was as a result of government auditors being involved through the Auditor General, by the way. Then, of course, you've got forensic auditors. Now, with forensic auditors, definitely they would work hand in hand with the government auditors when need be, especially if there's suspicion that there's fraudulent activity that has taken place. So when you're talking of forensic auditors, these are what we call fraud investigators or fraud auditors. So with forensic auditors, they concentrate on investigating and gathering evidence where there's been an alleged financial mismanagement, theft, or even possibly fraud, right? And then, of course, you've got what we call special purpose auditors. With special purpose auditors, these are auditors who specialize, all right, in a particular field. It could be that they are only interested, or their only primary focus, it could be that they are dealing with environmental audits. They could be those that deals with compliance of environmental regulations, VAT auditors, and so on, just to name a few, right? So that's what we call special purpose auditors. Now, okay, it looks like our meeting it might cut us short, but we're going to reconnect again so that we can proceed from here. Is it okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So let's just give it a minute and then I'll restart the meeting. All right.
Okay.
Perfect.